Welcome to the Snowbirds Expat Radio Podcast, powered by the Snowbird US Day Tracker app. I'm your host, Gerry Scott, and my goal is to give you answers to your cross-border questions, to ease the stress of a cross-border move or extended trip, and to keep you up to date on all you need to know with cross-border rules and regulations. Now let's get on with the show. Terra and Ed, welcome to the Snowbirds Expat Radio Podcast. This is going to be a very, very popular show for my wife alone because we travel back and forth to Maui and we can't figure out how Oprah is able to ship her dogs and not have any hassles, but yet the rest of us seem to have hassles. So before we get into the questions about dogs and cars and trains and all the other things that you can ship down to the United States and back, tell us more about yourselves and your company.
Well, we both work for PCB Inc. We're based in Blaine, Washington, and we do import for pretty much anything that you can imagine coming in. Ed actually specializes in, Ed, sorry if I'm talking for you, vehicles, and I mainly do like FDA, food goods, USDA, plants, animals, things like that. I've been with the company 19 years, Ed?
I've only been with us with PCB for about 6 years. Got about 40 years. I hate to say it, but 40 years in the business. And right now, I'm just focused on the machinery and vehicle imports right now.
Well, I got to tell you, like I say, this is anytime I have a guest on our podcast, I'm a sponge. I mean, there's so much, because we are going back and forth. We live in a little town called Wailuku in Maui, on Maui, and we live in Vancouver, Canada. So we are your neighbors to the north here. And I believe this relationship has come through, you guys are involved with the Can-Am Chamber of Commerce, I believe. Are you?
Probably on the Canadian side.
Yeah, we have a lot of branches. What would it have covered? I'm sure that we've done a lot of work with them.
Oh, okay. Somehow you got connected with Carson Hamill, who's my son-in-law, and he said, I'm always asking about shipping vehicles and dealing with pets. So we get a lot of those questions because we deal with so many people that have homes in the States and they're going back and forth. Well, tell you what, let's jump right into it. And this is the big one. Before we came on live here, I used my GPT chat, my AI tool, and I wanted to find out how was Oprah able to ship her ship her animals to Maui. And of course, if you have a private jet, you can do whatever you want. But how does the average person deal with a dog that they're trying to ship down for the winter?
So the average person into Hawaii and Guam, I think it is, they have their own quarantine requirements when they go in, regardless of it being even from other U.S. states but as well as other countries, because they're coming from, I assume, Canada, right?
Correct.
Or another country. So that's a low or no risk country. So it would require the fairly new regulations. It kind of shifted in the last not even full year. But you would go on the CDC website, and there's actually a 2-page application that you would complete, and it gives you like a little receipt that it's been filed. You do want to do that about 2 to 10 days prior to either the sailing or probably a flight, I'm thinking, coming over. And then when they go into port, you would show that receipt. That will get you basically in. As far as the very specific requirements for the quarantine in Hawaii itself, I don't have the setup for that, but there are, for things that require quarantine, I know federally, like overall, and I don't know if this applies because it could be different statewide. The quarantine is normally, I believe, can be waived if you have like a service animal, and that's not the same as the support animals. This is like an actual service animal that's being transported with the person using it is gone through the proper training and is registered as one. I don't remember her situation with her dogs, but
yeah, you know what? When I did go online and I was reading about this, they actually say it could be 5 days or less, providing you have all the proof of rabies vaccinations, blood tests, microchip, and other health records. So I guess it's becoming more and more common for people to just ship their animals. So if I drop my dog off, Albert, who's the big Bermudoodle, what is the process? Do I drive down to Blaine? Do I just show up at your doorstep and here's Albert, get him to Maui? How does that whole process work?
So there's different situations because you have what's viewed as like a personal report where you can do self-declarations. That's going to kind of involve whether specifically, let's focus on like a land border movement from Canada. We're northern border, so we see a lot of things coming from Canada over in the northern border, right here in Blaine, actually. If you were to drive your animal yourself, it'd be just kind of a self-declaration. If you were to hire a pet carrier, you would have to have an invoice. Unfortunately, in certain situations where, say, your dog might be of a special breed and you have to put a value on it, the value can actually determine if you're required to use a broker, in which you still have to meet the same like USDA and CDC regulations, but then you're going to have to meet also U.S. Customs regulations as far as filing an entry and who can carry it across. If you're going by like an airport, then you would definitely want to check with the airline to see after COVID and during COVID restrictions on what airlines will take what pets, and the procedures for that, like for the pre-clearance, have changed a little bit. So I don't have information specific to each airport, but you would want to call ahead of time. The same filings would have to be completed, like the CDC application and everything. And normally if it's going cargo, so there's a difference also between carry-on and cargo. So again, you'd have to check with your airline of what they allow. Cargo specifically, like you would normally drop the pet off and then arrange for the pickup once it got into, the destination port. With that, there are, and I don't know if I'm veering off too much, but if you're dealing with, say, a longer flight and it's maybe transiting other countries for whatever reason, the difference between doing like a carry-on or self-carry pet and one that's in cargo would be if say the country that it was transiting through ended up being one that would be considered high risk. If it's a carry-on, you're then going to have to meet the regulations of an animal that's been to that country of high risk. If it's cargo, it kind of bypasses those regulations because it's not, from my understanding, being exposed to anything when it's on the...
So really, as a custom broker, then you take care of all the paperwork, you take care of everything. So and then just coordinate everything with the airport. Say it's WestJet or Air Canada. So that's what you do. So we would, do we show up with the pet, or is it something that would be? So
as a broker, the brokers ourselves will help you with like the filing. If you're going to be doing a clearance with U.S. Customs, we'll help you with that specific filing. If you're handling everything yourself, you can hire us. We can point you in the right direction of all the forms. Like the CDC application, you'd have to fill that out yourself, but we could show you where and how to do that, find the instructions. Freight isn't something that's automatically linked to a brokerage, but like PCB, and I know a number of other brokerages offer that service in addition to, so it's kind of like a one-stop shop. You can request that we arrange everything from hookup to helping you arrange the clearance and the movement of your animal to, having it send final destination. And it's just kind of what steps you needed assistance with, as to pretty much kind of brokers are, I'd say at least us, trying to find the best way to coordinate it either way. Like as much as you need, we should be able to kind of hit every topic.
How common is it? Are people doing this more than ever before?
As far as pets, it's really hard to tell as a broker. We don't see a lot of those that would just clear like a self-declaration, like if you drove or flew them without needing our assistance and you filed the documents yourself. So I don't have as good of an understanding as the number of that, but I would say like the purchases of, say, people getting pets or puppies, especially from Canada, like breeders like that. It was really popular during COVID, and I want to say there have been some changes to the regulations that has kind of, personally, I would say, seen like a decrease and that recently, but that doesn't mean that it won't increase. I know a lot of people got animals during COVID, kind of like a comfort thing, but that was definitely, we had a huge increase in the accounts that we saw in the animals.
Interesting. Now, outside of dogs and cats, I mean, are are they bringing their rare birds with them, or?
We've seen a couple birds. I think I want to say the strangest one was courier pigeon or some type of pigeon. Yeah, was that it? So not something that is all that common, but a little bit. And those ones are more circumstantial. So say if you have birds, they're considered pets up to a certain number. So if you have one or two birds, those can come in. Of course, species is going to play a part in that. If you have something that's exotic or considered endangered, you're going to have to look at fish and wildlife regulations, regardless of whether it's your pet or not. And also the number of birds or the type of species. If it's something classified as a poultry, like a chicken or a turkey, it's never going to be viewed as a pet. It won't be allowed to be viewed as a pet. So you'll have to meet the regulations of like an agriculture, like a farm animal coming in. And then if you have 6 birds or more, regardless of whether they're your pets or not, you're going to have to do a customs clearance. It's, I guess, too many. But something like dogs, there's no limit on the number of dogs you can bring in as long as you fill the appropriate paperwork out for each one.
You know, it's interesting because obviously the number one, we're, as humans now, because we've gone through the pandemic and COVID, we started seeing quarantines and all these things. How does I guess the biggest fear is these dogs have rabies and there could be a rabies breakout and the whole works. But I mean, is there any signs that these dogs when you have your dog, you never, other than taking it to the vet when it's sick and it takes shots. I mean, what is the fear in Canada that we could have a rabies breakout? Do you hear about that at all?
I don't say that I honestly do. Is that something you've
Never heard of it.
like? I know it's very low risk and it very, very uncommon. Like, I don't know that I've even heard reports of that happening, but I guess it's just one of those things where being cautious about it, taking the precautionary approach just to avoid it so we don't have to find out, I guess.
Yeah, that's interesting. So outside of pets, and this is where Ed comes in, I'm sure, is that what else are you seeing, for that snowbird market where these snowbirds, these Canadians living down south, what is the big thing that they're doing out there right now? Are they shipping vehicles? Are they just, what exactly are they doing?
It's hard to say. It's varies case by case. One of the most common questions we get is people that take down a trailer or something like that, and then they want to keep it down here. There's certain rules apply. The Canadians generally, they have a 6-month visa that's just stamping. They're allowed to take whatever they can carry across the border, whatever they want. That includes vehicles. We get a question about importing a vehicle, whether or not they have to import them. And, not really. You use your trailer, use your vehicle for 6 months without worrying about too much. You might get a little bit of trouble from the state. They might want you to pay taxes or something on it, but you're visiting, so don't worry about that. One thing outside of vehicles, what we find is people trying to bring in a lot of household goods, stuff like that. And if it's with them at the time they cross the border, it's really not an issue. They can do that. But if it's separate, where we run into a problem is that in order to have the right to make entry, you have to have some type of status in the U.S. Or just owning property doesn't generally give you an immigrant status in order to file an entry. Now, there's things you can do as a property owner. We can work into get a tax ID for you under certain circumstances where we can file an entry for goods that you want to bring in. Like, let's say couches, chairs, and stuff like that. We get a lot of people that do shopping that are down in Palm Springs, and they do shopping online, and they buy a bunch of furniture from a store in Victoria. They want it shipped to them. There's steps you got to take before you do that. Big key here is having some type of immigration status, and if failing that, a tax ID works just fine. I tell people, if you have property, why don't you get a non-working social security number? It's good for opening bank accounts. It's valid. It's just not valid for employment. In other words, it's no good for collecting taxes or working. But it does give you an ID, and it does allow you to have goods consigned to you. And that it does give you, basically puts you on file with customs to do an import. And that works for vehicles. It will work for anything pretty much at all.
Are you talking to more like a TIN number, tax identification number, just so when they sell their house, the same idea?
TIN, yeah, it's similar. But what we can do is go on the Social Security site and look it up. If you don't have one, what we do is we try to get customs to assign a number for you.
Okay.
Usually it's just some property record showing that you do reside down there, in a statement that you're only going to be in the residence for 6 months at a time. And once we have that on file, then we're also good to import again.
Is it quite common for like a lot of these Canadians, they have their green card, they want to come home, and maybe after yesterday's election, if you're for the Republicans or against them, there could be a little bit more activity on the borders. In fact, the first thing we saw this morning was a big article saying Canadians are coming home that have worked in Canada for years. So let's say, for example, I lived in the United States for the last 40 years. I have a green card. So if I want to take all my possessions and move home, your firm would be the people that would you help me with that entire process, the entire move, or is it just the customs work that you guys would be doing?
Going into Canada, you'd be returning residents. I'm not too familiar with first mill tax going into Canada. The Canadian side would really be the ones to advise on that. The other way around, we have our own, the U.S. has a declaration for personal effects. So if you're moving, you just fill out the document, declare all your goods, and it can come in. But if you have a green card, that's your status. That's fine. You'll have all your ID, and it's really a simple process. Canada is, from what I recall, I'm a dual. I worked in Canada for several years originally. They do have a similar process. It's if you own the goods for over a year and they're your own personal goods, you basically fill out some declarations and bring it back. And we would work with the carrier to more or less coordinate it. As far as the declaration, that's really up to the importer, the person returning.
Is it common for companies like PCB to have a customs clearance on both sides of the border? Or in this case, you would just be a U.S. entity?
Well, some do, some don't. We're not unique. There's competitors that are on both sides of the border. Just like there's integrators that are in the U.S., they're also in Europe. It's just depends on their business style. Depends on what kind of paradigm they want for themselves. This was PCB's been around quite a while. It was formed by an agency from many brokers, and then took over all of the brokerage itself on the Canadian side. They opened up here on the U.S. in 2000s, and it's kind of nice because you can coordinate things back and forth. You also have a good opportunity to serve your customer better both ways, like in Canada and in the U.S. If you're importing into Canada, that works for, we can do that. If you decide to be a non-resident importer into the U.S., we can do that too. But we're not alone. We compete with people directly, and some are much larger than us, and some are smaller.
What is the number one purpose of a custom broker? Is it collecting tariffs and taxes and fees, or what is the number one role that you would have to execute?
Bill.
Yeah, the regulations. I mean, like collecting taxes. Yeah, and I think customs would say that's probably pretty big, important part of it. But really, I think the majority of our role is just to ensure that your products are allowed in, and if they are allowed in, that you're meeting all the requirements. You have to realize and just like as you kind of determine with the vehicles and with the pets, there's not just U.S. customs that you have to deal with, but there's all these other government agencies that are associated with the moves, and you have to meet their regulations. So your customs broker is going to know exactly all of the different steps for all of the different government agencies that you'll have to meet, because you could be subject to one, you could be subject to 3 or 4, depending on what your commodity is. Let you know what taxes that is a part of it that you're going to be paying, if there's any way to mitigate or get relief on those duties and taxes based on country of origin or a trade agreement that might be available. and just kind of letting you know all your options to make sure you're compliant so that you don't have to deal with issues with customs later on if they were to do an audit, and to see if it's really something that's worth your while. You know, some people show up without doing the research at the border and they're in way over their heads, and it's not financially, how do you word that? Like, it's really, you know, they've maybe spent a couple $1,000s on something, and now with the clearance fees and the taxes and everything, they're barely breaking even, and it's just not worth it to them, and they didn't know any better.
Now, not to make this the business political, but after yesterday's election and the Republicans being more focused on protection of, we're hearing that tariffs and, a Republican government might be a little bit more difficult with tariffs and free trade and all these things. In your industry, do you guys give much consideration how this is going to either make your business harder or busier? Do you guys give much thought to that? Or it sounds funny, but
do we give thought to it, or do they? Like, do we give thought? Like, do we have an opinion on it, or
not so much opinion? But when you guys had your staff meetings, you say, listen, if it's a Democratic presidency, hey, things are going to be the same. If it's Republican, it's going to get busier. Do you guys ever have that conversation, believing things could get tougher or easier? Or, well,
I think it comes up in a more casual sense right now, because there's what you hear is going to happen, and then what kind of trickles down and ends up really coming through the works and ends up being a regulation can be so different, and the time frame that it takes. So I think right now it's more of a casual conversation, maybe a joking. It's something that we've, with the 25% we've dealt with already now. So I think we'll be kind of prepared as to what to expect. Yeah.
It's kind of, politically, it changes things a little bit. Like what Terra just mentioned about the 25% tax or duty on Chinese goods. That originally was a Republican thing from 4 years ago, and it was a protectionist. It was actually under the defense ruling or something like that. It was something to collect tariffs on Chinese goods as a defense mechanism of some type. When the administration changed 4 years ago, last election, turned to Democrat, we thought a lot of people going, well, those tariffs got to go away now. Those were Republican tariffs that put on. And we had a lot of people calling in saying, I'm going to bring in these in from China. There shouldn't be any duty on them now. Democrats are in charge. They didn't change the rules at all. They, in fact, there's more duties on Chinese goods now than there was 4 years ago. So we're waiting to see what happens on this one. At least personally I am, because it's kind of like, there's rumors around. The federal government, the only constitutional taxes that they can collect are duties. The excise taxes, sales taxes, aren't really in the Constitution. So I feel there's going to be a push for the federal government to increase a lot of the tariffs on imports. And I don't know if that's going to affect the USMCA, the trade agreements. I noticed that a lot of them have fallen apart. Like, we had a general systems preferences, and that was for third world developing countries for duty-free treatment. I see that falling off. Like, Turkey's gone now and things like that. Countries just seem to be gone. India, and those are countries that used to get that treatment. They're gone. And I don't know if that's, I think it's more of a protectionist, but I think it's a drive to get more revenue. And I'm curious to see what happens coming up now, because these tariffs probably are going to get higher.
I hope you got something out of this. All I can tell you, what I've learned, is don't let the cat out of the bag. Thank you again for listening to the Snowbird Expat Radio Podcast. The best way you can support the podcast is to forward the episode to a friend, and please don't hesitate to like, subscribe, or leave a comment. Now, before you go, let me leave you with one of my favorite quotes. Be kind to all, the world is small.